The night Thea Vesper walked out onto her porch with a lantern and a wooden bucket of feed, she did not yet know that the wolf at her fence was wearing an iron collar under the matted fur of his throat, forge-marked with the sigil of the same lord who had taken her husband 2 winters before. She did not know that 350 riders of the Iron Reach pack were already moving across the moor in a wide black crescent, the hooves of their horses muffled by peat and rain. A coffin cage of cold iron lashed between 2 of them on a litter, built narrow and built for one specific neck. She did not know that on the ridge above her homestead, hidden behind a stand of bent rowans, 11 other riders sat their horses without speaking and watched her lantern through the sheeting rain to learn what kind of woman she was. She knew only what was in front of her, a storm bigger than any she had weathered. A barn lantern hung from the post behind her so the wind would not drown it. A wooden bucket in her hand, heavy with crushed oats and the dried apple ends she had been saving for the goat. And, on the far side of her own broken rail fence, a wolf. He was wrong-sized. That was the first thing her healer's eye caught, before fear, before pity, before any of the proper feelings. He was too big for any moor wolf she had ever seen, and too thin for any wolf that big to still be alive. His coat was matted with rain, and worse than rain, dark patches that did not reflect the lantern at all. He was standing the way an animal stands when standing has become a deliberate act, 4 legs locked, head low, ribs visible through fur. And he was watching her. Wolves did not watch people the way he was watching her. Wolves looked at threats and looked at prey and looked at noise. This one looked at her as if he had been told, somewhere behind those eyes, that she was the last door in a corridor of closed ones. His eyes were not gold. They were the color of river stones under ice, dull and gray-green and a little blue at the edges, with rain running down into the lower lashes. They did not glow. They did not catch the lantern. They only held her. Thea stood there in her dead husband's oilskin coat, with the rain finding every gap in the seams, and she thought, very clearly and without drama, I have 2 choices. I can go back inside and bar the door and listen to whatever happens out here until morning. Or I can do the other thing. She thought of Halden, her husband, who had walked out into a blizzard worse than this one to answer a sick child's call, because that was who he was, and who had not come back, because that was who the moor was. She thought of the small girl asleep on the bench by her hearth, the foundling Pell, 6 years old and silent as snow, who had been left at Thea's gate the winter after Halden died, wrapped in a flour sack and a man's wool scarf, and who had not spoken a single word in the 2 winters since. She thought of how Pell, when she had a nightmare, did not cry out, because she could not, and only pressed her small, cold hand against Thea's wrist in the dark until Thea woke up. She thought of all of this in the space of 1 breath, and then she turned around and walked back into her house. She did not bar the door. She set the lantern on the table. She went to the feed barrel by the hearth, where Pell was a small shape under the patchwork quilt, breathing slow. She tipped the bucket full of oats and the last of the dried apple ends. She added a handful of mutton fat she had been rendering for soap, because anything that thin needed fat more than it needed grain. Then she carried the bucket back out into the rain. The wolf had not moved. The fence was an old one, 3 rails of split larch silvered by weather. The bottom rail rotted through near the gatepost. Thea did not open the gate. She did not trust that. Not because she did not trust him, but because she had been raised in the moor, and the moor had taught her that trust was a thing you offered in small portions, never all at once. She crouched on her side of the rail. The mud sucked at her boots. She set the bucket down on the bare patch of trodden ground just inside her fence line, close enough that he could reach it by putting his head between the rails. Then she stood up and took 3 steps back, both hands open at her sides, and waited. He looked at the bucket. He looked at her. He did not move for a long time. Long enough that Thea felt the rain finally find the back of her neck and start a cold line down her spine. Long enough that she had time to think, properly this time, you do not know what he is. And then he lowered his great, matted head and stepped forward, slow as an old man with bad knees, and put his muzzle through the rails to the bucket. He ate the way starving things eat, which is not greedily. Greedily was for animals that had eaten yesterday. He ate as if each swallow were an experiment he was waiting to see the result of. Thea watched. She watched the way his shoulder blades stood up like tent poles under the wet fur. She watched the way his back leg trembled and then locked and then trembled again. She watched the way, when he had eaten about half of what was in the bucket, he lifted his head and looked at her again over the rim. Oats stuck to his black lip, and something in the look was so close to a thank you in a language she did not speak that she had to look away at her own lantern for a moment, because her eyes had filled up without her permission. When she looked back, he had lain down. Right there, in the mud on the far side of her fence, with the rain coming down on him. He had folded his long legs under him and put his enormous head on his paws and closed his eyes, the bucket still half full in front of his nose, as if her yard had been the destination he had been walking toward for some time, and he could not be made to walk any further tonight. Thea stood in the rain and looked at this creature she did not know, and she said to him, out loud and quietly, the way she spoke to Pell sometimes when Pell was working very hard at sleeping, I cannot bring you inside. I am sorry. I cannot. There is a child. The wolf did not open his eyes. His ribs rose and fell. Thea went back to the porch and unhooked the lantern from the barn post and brought it down and hung it from the fence post nearest him so that whatever else happened, he would not lie in the dark. She did not sleep. She sat in the rocker by the hearth with her healer's bag at her feet and a kettle on the hook over the low coals, and she listened to the storm work the shutters and the door. Once, around what she guessed was the deep middle of the night, she got up and looked out the small window beside the door, and the lantern was still burning on the fence post, and the wolf was still there. A long, dark shape in the rain, and she could just see, in the small yellow circle of light, that his eyes were open again, watching the door, watching her. She poured a cup of the broth she had been keeping warm for herself, and she drank it slowly, and she thought about what she had done. She had been a hedge healer's wife, and now she was a hedge healer in her own right, and a healer knew that you did not feed something you could not finish feeding. You did not bind a wound you could not return to. You did not warm a body you could not keep warm. Mercy that ran out part way was crueler than no mercy at all. She had given him oats and apple ends and mutton fat. She had given him a lantern. She had given him, in a way she did not entirely understand, her word that she would not be the one to drive him off into that storm. And she did not know what he was. She thought about that too, about wrong-sized and wrong still, about the way his eyes had held her. She had grown up on her grandmother's stories, the Moore stories, the ones told around the peat fire when the men were out cutting turf, and the women had each other and the children and the dark. Wolves who were not only wolves. Wolves who had once been kings and had been driven into their second skin and could not find the way back. Wolves who would come to a hearth and ask, in the only way they had left, for a little bread. Thea had not believed those stories since she was 12. She did not believe them tonight either. Not exactly. She did not need to believe them. She only needed to know that the thing on the other side of her fence had looked at her like a creature asking. And she had answered. That was all. The first thunder of the riders reached her before the dawn did. She felt it through the floorboards before she heard it. A low rolling pressure, like a herd of cattle being moved at speed, but wrong, organized, all the hooves coming in measured bands. She set her cup down. She got up. She crossed to the bench by the hearth and laid one hand on Pel's small shoulder under the quilt, very gently, and the child opened her dark eyes at once, the way she always did, without surprise, as if she had been waiting. Thea put a finger to her own lips. Pel nodded. Thea bundled her in the quilt and lifted her down off the bench and carried her into the small back room where Halden's chest still sat at the foot of the bed, and she settled Pel into the narrow space behind the chest with the quilt all around her. "Stay," she mouthed. The child nodded again. Her small hand came out from under the quilt and pressed against Thea's wrist for a moment in the old way, the only language they had, and then withdrew. Thea kissed the top of her head and closed the door behind her and went to meet whatever was coming. She stepped out onto the porch with no lantern this time because the eastern sky was already going gray and the rain had thinned to a fine drizzle. The wolf was on his feet. Thea did not know when he had stood up. He was on her side of the fence now, somehow, without having broken any of it that she could see, standing at the bottom of her porch steps with his great wet head turned away from her and toward the ridge road. His ears were flat to his skull. The fur at his shoulders was raised. She saw, in the gray light, what she had not been able to see by lantern. There was something dark and heavy under the matted fur of his throat. A ring of it, biting into the flesh. Not a collar in any usual sense. It looked forged, crude and thick, the dull gray of iron that had been a long time in weather. It had marks on it. She could not read them from where she stood. The wolf did not look at her. He looked at the ridge. And then the riders came down off the ridge. They came in a wide wing, not of a gallop, at a steady working trot, 3 abreast on the wider stretches and single file where the path narrowed. And they kept coming, and they kept coming. Thea was a country woman, and she did not count well past 100 without making a mark. But she had stood at enough market fairs to know what 100 people looked like, and what she was seeing was more than 3 of those. Their cloaks were gray and black, and 1 in every dozen of them carried a long pole spear with a horsetail at the head. And at the center of the column, slung between 2 heavy draft horses on a litter of crossed iron bars, was a cage. The cage was the wrong shape. It was not square. It was long and low and narrow, with a flared opening at one end, and Thea, who had set many bones and who knew the shape of every joint in the human and animal body, looked at it once and understood. It was built to fit one neck, one specific neck. The flared end was meant to lock around shoulders that were exactly this wide. The narrow end was meant to close on a throat that was exactly that thick. She had never seen such a thing in her life, and she had grown up on the moor where they hanged sheep thieves at the crossroads. She had time, while they came on, to feel her own heart in her chest, beating very hard and very evenly, the way it had beaten the night she had walked into the snow looking for Halden, and found only his stick. The wolf at the foot of her steps did not run. He lowered his head, and he widened his stance, and a sound came out of him that was not a growl exactly. Lower than that. More like a stone being dragged across a stone underwater. The lead rider broke off from the column and walked his horse the last 20 paces to her gate alone. He was a tall man under a gray cloak, clean-shaven, with hair the color of wet straw and eyes that were almost colorless in the dawn light. He wore a sigil at his shoulder, a hammer crossed over a chain. Thea knew that sigil. Every woman on the moor knew that sigil. It was the mark of Lord Austryn of Ironreach, the man whose hunters had ridden through the village 2 winters past on the night Halden went out to answer the sick child's call, and whose men had been the last people to see her husband alive. The rider stopped his horse at her gate. He looked at her. He looked at the wolf on her porch steps. He smiled, with no warmth in it, and he said, "Good wife, we have come for our king." Thea did not answer at first. She stood on her porch with her hands at her sides, and she let him say it again, because the Moor had taught her that men who came to your gate with 350 riders behind them usually said the important thing twice. He did. "We have come," he said, "for our king. The dog at your steps is our property. Step aside and we will not damage your fencing." The wolf had not moved. Thea looked at the rider's face. She looked at the column behind him, the long crescent of horsemen now drawn up along her road and bending around the back of her paddock, 350 mounted men, and the cage on its litter, and the spears. And she said, in the flat country voice that she had used on tacksmen and bad-tempered husbands, and the boys who had once tried to steal her chickens, "You have the wrong house." The rider's smile did not change. "We watched him cross your fence line last night, good wife. We watched you feed him. We have been on his trail for 9 days. We will not be having a discussion about which house." Thea did not look at the wolf. She kept her eyes on the rider. "He is a wolf. I gave a wolf some oats. If you want to take a wolf off my land, you may try, but I would advise against doing it in front of me." The rider considered her. He was perhaps 50 years old up close, with very fine lines around his pale eyes and the kind of mouth that had stopped expecting to be surprised by anything. "Good wife," he said. "Your name?" "Thea Vesper." "Vesper." He turned the name over once in his mouth, the way a man turns a coin. "Halden Vesper's widow." "So." He nodded once to himself, as if a thing he had suspected had been confirmed and would now be useful. "Good wife Vesper, I will give you the courtesy of plain speech, since you are owed it. The animal at your steps is not an animal. He is the last living son of the Hale line, the bloodline you and your husband used to whisper prayers for on the old feast nights, before Lord Austryn's writ made such prayers a hanging matter. He was cursed into that shape 6 years ago by a working we paid a great deal of silver for, and the iron at his throat is what holds him in it. He has been running across these moors for 9 days because we lost him at the river. He came to your fence because he is starving, and because he was bred in the human part of him that is still in there somewhere under all of that, to come to a healer's door. You did not feed a wolf. You fed a deposed king who cannot speak to thank you. Now step aside." Thea heard him. She heard every word. She let the words go through her like cold water, and she watched what they did to her insides, which was less than the rider seemed to be expecting. Part of her, the village wife part, wanted to laugh. Part of her, the healer's part, looked again at the iron ring under the matted throat fur and thought, "That is a wound. That has been a wound for 6 years, and the flesh around it must be a ruin." And part of her, the part that had been Halden's wife and was now no one's wife, looked at the rider with the hammer and chain at his shoulder and thought, "You are lying." She could not have said how she knew. It was not a thread behind her breastbone. It was not a hum. It was the way the rider had said the human part of him that is still in there somewhere, as if he were quoting a line he had been taught for exactly this conversation. And the way his eyes had flicked, just once, to the cage on the litter when he said, "cursed" into that shape. A man who believed his own story did not need to glance at the prop. "You have a coffin built for a neck." The rider's smile sharpened. "We have a restraint built for a specific animal. You ride 350 men to fetch one cursed king who you say cannot fight you because he has no hands." The rider said nothing. "I am not stepping aside." The rider sighed. It was a small sound and not unkind. The sigh of a man who had been hoping a thing would go one way and had now to accept that it would go the other. He raised one gloved hand and the column behind him moved. Not all of it. 20 riders peeled off the front of the crescent and walked their horses forward in a tight wedge, and 4 of them dismounted and unslung short curved staves from their saddles, and one of them began to unlash the cage from its litter. Thea felt for the first time the proper fear. Not the fear of one man at her gate, the fear of the arithmetic. 20 men with staves and a cage against one woman on a porch and a starving animal with an iron collar. She did not move. She thought of Pell behind the chest in the back room. She thought of Halden's stick in the snow. She thought very clearly, if I step aside now, I will never be able to stand on this porch again without knowing I did it. "You will not put that cage on him in my yard." The rider looked at her with what was almost regret. "Good wife, you are one woman." "I am the woman whose fence he chose." The lead rider opened his mouth to answer, and then a horn sounded. It was not from his column. It came from the ridge above the moor, high and thin, 3 short notes and a long one, and every horse in the Iron Reach line threw up its head at once, and the rider with the hammer and chain sigil went very still in his saddle. Thea looked past him, up the long gray slope to the ridge, and saw movement there for the first time. 11 riders. Not 350. 11. They came down off the ridge at a walk, not a charge, and they came in a single line, and the cloaks they wore were not gray or black. They were the color of old blood, deep and dull, with a thin band of white at the hem. The lead rider among the 11 carried no sigil at his shoulder that Thea could see. He carried instead, across the front of his saddle, a long bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. And as he came down the slope, he unwrapped one end of it, and the dawn caught on something at that end that was not a spear point. It was a small iron key. The man from Iron Reach at her gate said a word under his breath that Thea did not know but understood the shape of. He turned his horse half around to face the ridge. Behind him, the wedge of 20 men halted with the cage half off its litter. The 11 riders came on. They did not hurry. The lead one of them was a tall man perhaps a few years older than Thea, dark-haired and dark-bearded, with a long face weathered by wind and a mouth that did not look like it had smiled recently. He rode straight to her gate and stopped his horse beside the Iron Reach man's horse and did not look at the Iron Reach man at all. He looked at Thea. And then, slowly and deliberately, he looked past Thea to the wolf at the foot of her porch steps. And the look that went across his face then was the look of a man seeing his oldest brother alive after being told for 6 years that the body had been burned. He did not speak for a moment. When he did, his voice was hoarse, like a voice that had not been used at full volume in a long time. "Good wife, my name is Elroy of the Hyle Riders. That creature on your porch is my charge, and has been since he was 4 months old. I owe you, already, more than I can pay. Please, do not give him up." The Iron Reach man laughed. It was a short, ugly sound. "The Hyle Riders. 11 of you. There were 120 of you a year ago. Elroy of the Hyel Riders did not look at him. He kept his eyes on Thea. There were 120 of us a year ago. There are 11 of us now. He is what we have left. Thea looked at him. She looked at the wolf. She looked at the cage. She felt, behind her breastbone, a small sharp tug, like a thread being pulled through the eye of a healer's needle. And she did not know yet what it meant, only that it was the first new sensation she had felt in 2 winters that had not been grief. The Iron Reach man recovered himself quickly. Thea watched him do it. The corners of his mouth tightened and then relaxed, and the colorless eyes settled. And when he spoke again, his voice had the careful warmth of a man explaining a complicated matter to children. Goodwife Vesper, you are being lied to. These 11 are outlaws. They have been hunted across 3 counties under Lord Ostran's writ for the murder of a magistrate and the burning of a tithe barn. The animal at your steps is, as I told you, the last of a cursed line, and they want him because they intend to use his blood for a working that will undo lawful rulership across this moor and put a beast back on a throne. You are a hedge healer. You are not a politician. Step inside your house, bar your door, and let the men with the authority of the realm conduct the realm's business in your yard. No harm will come to you or to whatever else you have inside. Thea did not move. She heard the whatever else you have inside and understood that he had been listening for the second breath in the house and had heard it. She kept her face still. Lord Ostran's writ does not run to my fence. Goodwife, Lord Ostran's writ runs to every fence on this moor. Then Lord Ostran may come tell me so himself. The Iron Reach man's patience, which had been a thin garment, came off. He turned his head and made a small gesture, and the wedge of 20 men finished unlashing the cage from the litter and lifted it down. It rang dully against the wet ground. The 4 men with the short, curved staves walked forward. Elroy of the Hale Riders moved his horse 1 step forward into the gateway. He still did not look at the Iron Reach man. He said to Thea, in the same low voice, "Goodwife, may I dismount?" "Yes." He dismounted. He moved like a man who had been in the saddle too many days in a row, slowly and with care for his own joints. And when he was on the ground, he was tall. Taller than she had thought, with shoulders that had been broader before whatever had reduced his 120 riders to 11. He left his horse standing in the gate. He walked past the Iron Reach man without acknowledgement, and through her gate and up her path, and stopped at the bottom of her porch steps, 4 paces from the wolf. And he went down very carefully onto 1 knee in the mud. He did not reach out. He put his hands on his own thighs, palms up, and he bowed his head, and he said something in a language Thea did not know. 4 short words, soft as a prayer. The wolf, who had not taken his stone-colored eyes off the Iron Reach man for the entire exchange, turned his great matted head slowly and looked down at Elroy. The growl that had been rumbling somewhere in his chest stopped. He did not lick Elroy's face. He did not nuzzle him. He only looked for a long moment, and then he lowered his nose and pressed it, once, very briefly, against the crown of Elroy's bent head. Then he raised his head again and put his eyes back on the Iron Reach man. Elroy made a sound that was not a word, and Thea saw the broad shoulders shake once, and then he mastered himself and stood up. He turned to face the Iron Reach man for the first time. "You will not put that cage on him. There are 349 of us and 10 of you, Hyle, and a widow. There are 11 of us and a widow." The Iron Reach man looked at Thea with something that was almost amused. "So there are. Then there are 12 of you." He raised his gloved hand again, and the 4 men with the staves came forward through the gate. Thea moved. She did not plan it. Her body did it before her mind caught up. She came down off her porch in 3 quick steps and put herself between the wolf and the 4 men, and she heard, behind her, the rough scrape of Elroy's boots in the mud as he closed up at her shoulder, and the wolf made the underwater stone sound again behind both of them. The 4 men stopped. They were younger than the lead rider. They looked at her, and then they looked back at him, waiting. "Good wife, step aside." "No. I will give you a count. I will count to 3. On 3, my men will take you off your feet and put you in your own kitchen. They will not strike you. You will not be harmed." "And the child?" The Iron Reach man's eyes flickered, just for a heartbeat. "So there is a child. Pity. The child will not be harmed either, good wife, unless something happens to make it impossible to protect her." 1. Elroy at her shoulder shifted his weight onto the balls of his feet. 2. Thea did not move. She heard, very far away inside herself, Holden's voice on the morning he had left for the sick child's coal, the last morning, saying mildly that he would be back by supper. 3. The 4 men came forward, and several things happened at once, and Thea could not afterwards put them in the right order. The wolf left the porch. She felt the heat of him go past her left hip, and she heard the snap of his jaws meeting on the wrist of the foremost man, and the man's short scream and the iron stave hitting the wet ground. Elroy was past her on the right with a short, heavy knife that he had not been wearing visibly a moment before. And the second man was on his back in the mud with both hands pressed to his face. The 3rd and 4th men had stopped and stepped back. From the ridge above, a second horn sounded. The 10 remaining Heil riders moved their horses forward off the ridge at a working trot. 10 riders, not 11. 10. And the front rank of the Iron Reach Crescent broke and reformed. 345 horsemen wheeling into a defensive shape. The Iron Reach lead rider had drawn a long, straight sword. The wolf, with the man's wrist in his jaws, was being dragged sideways by his own clamped grip as the man tried to crawl backwards. Thea saw the iron collar at his throat catch the dawn light and saw, plainly this time, the markings on it. Hammer crossed over chain. The same sigil that was at the lead rider's shoulder. The same sigil that had been on the saddlecloths of the riders who had ridden past her cottage 2 winters ago on the night Halden did not come back. She heard herself, in a voice that was very calm and did not belong to the woman on the porch, say, "You said he was cursed by a working you paid silver for." The Iron Reach man, with his sword half raised, did not answer. "Why is your own lord's mark on the iron at his throat?" The Iron Reach man looked at her with the particular attention of a man who has just realized that the conversation has slipped sideways under him. He did not answer that either. Elroy of the Heil riders, with his short knife loose in his hand and the wolf at his side now releasing the wrist of the moaning man, said, in a voice that was no longer hoarse, "Because there is no curse. There has never been a curse. The collar is the working. The collar is what holds him in the shape. Take the collar off, and you have a man again." He turned his head and looked at Thea, and the keysmith who forged it for Lord Austrian was strangled in his bed 3 nights after delivery. "The only key in the world is the one I have on my saddle." The Iron Reach man swung his sword at Elroy's neck. The blade did not land. The wolf was in the air before Thea understood that the wolf could still move that fast, and he hit the Iron Reach man's horse at the shoulder, and the horse screamed and went down sideways with the rider half under it, and the sword went into the mud half a pace from Elroy's boot. The 10 Hyle riders had crossed the last of the slope by then, and the Iron Reach crescent was a crescent no longer, but a sloppy curved knot of 345 mounted men trying to decide whether the working morning had become a battle morning. And the 4 staff men were 3 now, the wolf-bitten one on his knees with the wrist pressed to his belly, and Thea Vesper found herself standing in her own yard, between the porch steps and her own gate, with her hands empty, and her heart beating the steady, measured way it had beaten that night in the snow. And she understood with a clean, cold clarity that whatever happened next was not going to be a battle. It was going to be a negotiation conducted by a small number of people standing very still, while a much larger number of people behind them held their weapons and waited to see what the small number decided. So she did not move, and Elroy of the Hyle riders, his short knife low at his side, did not move. And the wolf, having put the Iron Reach man's horse down, did not move either. He stood over the pinned rider with his great head lowered and his teeth showing white through the matted fur of his lip. And he waited. The Iron Reach man, with his ribs crushed against his own saddle and his sword 3 feet out of reach, did not move because he could not. He looked up at the wolf, and his colorless eyes were, for the first time since Thea had seen him, frightened. Thea heard, behind her, a small sound from her own back room. She heard the door open. She did not turn. She did not have to. She heard, in the soft, uneven steps of a 6-year-old in stockinged feet on a damp porch, Pell come out of the house. She heard the small steps cross the porch and come down the porch steps and cross the mud, and she felt, before she saw, the small, cold hand take hold of 2 of her fingers and squeeze. Then Pell let go of her hand and walked, very slowly, around her. Past Elroy, past the staff men, who watched her go by with the bewildered expressions of grown men who had been prepared to fight a widow and a wolf, and not a child. Past the lead rider trapped under his horse, and up to the wolf. The wolf turned his head. Thea felt every muscle in her own body lock. The child stopped 2 paces from the great matted shoulder. She did not reach out at first. She looked up at the wolf, and the wolf looked down at her, and Thea saw the wolf's stone-colored eyes do something she had not seen them do all night, which was soften. Pell lifted her right hand. She held it out, palm flat, fingers loose, in the gesture every moor child was taught for greeting a strange dog, and she laid it on the wet fur of his flank. She did not flinch. The wolf did not flinch. They stood there in the mud like that for what felt to Thea like a long time, and was probably 4 heartbeats. Then Pell turned her head and looked at the iron ring at the wolf's throat. She frowned. She walked, still slow, around to his front. She lifted both her small hands and placed them on either side of the iron collar, on the wet matted fur there, and she looked at the collar the way a 6-year-old looks at a knot in a piece of string. She tugged at the collar, gently, with both hands. The collar did not move. Pell turned around. She looked at Elroy. She held out one small, flat hand, palm up, the universal gesture of every child who has ever wanted a grown-up to hand over a tool. Elroy stared at her. Then he made a small sound that might have been a laugh if his throat had not been the wreck it was, and he walked back to his horse at the gate without looking at the Iron Reach man at all. And he unhooked the long oilcloth bundle from the front of his saddle, and he came back with the small iron key in his palm. He went down on one knee in the mud again beside the wolf, and he held the key out flat on his hand, and Pell took it from him with the small, frowning concentration of a child being trusted with something important. She turned back to the wolf. She rose up on her toes. The wolf, who was enormous, lowered his great head for her without being asked, and Thea heard, behind her, every Hyle rider on every horse breathe out at once, very softly, as if a thing they had been carrying for a long time had begun, fractionally, to come off their shoulders. Pell felt around the iron at the wolf's throat with her free hand. She found the seam. She found the keyhole. She fitted the key in. She turned it. There was a small click that Thea heard across the yard as clearly as a bell. The iron collar fell open in two halves and dropped into the mud at the wolf's feet. The wolf did not change. Thea, who had been braced for some kind of unfolding, some kind of cinematic shift of bone and fur into a man, saw nothing of the sort. The wolf lowered his nose to sniff the iron at his feet, the way a dog sniffs a thing that has been on his neck for a long time and is no longer there. And then he lifted his head, and the matted ruff of his throat was exposed, and Thea saw the wound. It was as bad as she had imagined, and worse. The iron had cut down through fur and skin and into the muscle in a ring all the way around. The flesh underneath was raw and weeping, and in places blackened. And there was the faint, sweet, rotten smell that a healer learns young and never forgets. The wolf swayed on his feet. He looked at Pell, and his stone-colored eyes were wet, and Thea did not know if it was the rain or not. Then he sat down. He sat down in the mud the way an exhausted dog sits down, with no grace, and he looked at Thea, and the look was the same look he had given her over the rim of the bucket the night before, which was, "Thank you," in a language she did not speak. Elroy of the Hale Riders said quietly, "He cannot change back." Thea, with her healer's eye still on the throat wound, said, "I know." The working was not in the collar alone. The collar was the lock. The working itself was set into him with the lock. With the lock off, he will live. He will heal. He will be a wolf. He will be a wolf for the rest of his life. The man who was inside him went out a long time ago. Thea looked up from the wound. She looked at Elroy. "You knew that." "We knew it 3 years ago. We have been protecting an animal for 3 years. We will protect him for the rest of his." He looked down at the wolf, and there was no hoarseness left in his voice at all. "He is still our king." Thea looked at the wolf. She looked at Pell, who had sat down in the mud beside the wolf's great front paw and was leaning her small head against his shoulder. She looked at the Iron Reach man pinned under his horse, and at the 345 riders who had come to put a coffin cage on a creature who was never going to wear a man's face again. She felt the small, sharp tug behind her breastbone for the second time, the thread through the healer's needle. And this time, she understood what it was. It was not a bond to the wolf. It was a bond to the choice. The choice she had made on the porch with the bucket. The choice she was about to make again. She turned to face the Iron Reach man under his horse. "You told my husband 2 winters ago that there was a sick child in the upper village. There was no sick child." "We checked." The Iron Reach man's colorless eyes flicked to her face and away. "You took him for the same reason you wanted this one. Because Lord Ostrin wanted a healer who could not be replaced and could not say no. And my Halden was the best head healer between the river and the ridge. And your lord had a working he wanted setting in iron that needed a healer's hand on it. Halden would not do it. So Halden did not come home." The Iron Reach man said nothing. He did not need to. Thea looked away from him. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel grief either, not in any new shape. She felt instead very tired and very clear. She said to Elroy without looking at him, "There are 345 of them, and 10 of you, and a widow and a child and a wolf. Yes. What do we do? Elroy did not answer at once. He looked instead at one of his own riders, a woman with gray at her temples who had come down off the ridge at his right hand, and who now sat her horse just inside Thea's gate, with her hood pushed back and her cloak open over a leather jerkin marked at the breast with a small pale sigil. Thea did not know. The woman nodded once at Elroy and dismounted and walked through the wet mud past the staffmen, who stepped aside for her without being told, and she came up to the pinned Iron Reach lead rider and crouched beside him. She did not touch him. Hamilton. The Iron Reach man's eyes closed briefly. Hamilton, you know me. The Iron Reach man, whose name Thea now had, opened his eyes and looked at her with something that was almost an old, used-up affection. Crystal, I had hoped you were dead. I had hoped the same of you. She looked up at Elroy. He is the steward of Ostran's war council. He is the one who put the order out for the keysmith. He drafted the writ on the Heil line himself. I served on the same council with him for 9 years. I know every man at his back, and I know which of them came because they believed the cursed king's story, and which of them came because Ostran pays in coin, and which of them came because they were told their own families would suffer if they did not. The first 2 will fight. The third will not. She turned her head and looked at the 345 riders behind her gate. She raised her voice, not to a shout, but to the carrying pitch that women on the moor use to call children in from the wind. Riders of Iron Reach, my name is Crystal of Veld. Many of you knew my husband. He died at the Second Battle of the River because he refused an order from this man. Hamilton's order. I want you to look at what is in this yard. There is a widow on her porch. There is a 6-year-old child in the mud with her hand on a wolf's shoulder. There is a wolf with a wound at his throat that has been a wound for 6 years. There is no curse. There is no working that needs his blood. There never was. There was a lord who wanted his land and the bloodline that held the title to it, and a steward who built him a cage to do it with, and a healer he murdered to set the iron. That healer's widow is the woman whose porch you are standing in front of. I am not asking you to ride against your lord. I am asking you to ride home. There was a silence. It went on long enough that Thea felt the rain start again, very fine. Then, from somewhere about 3 ranks deep in the Iron Reach column, a single rider turned his horse out of the line and walked it back the way the column had come. Not fast, not slow. He did not look at anyone as he went. Behind him, 4 more riders did the same thing. Then a dozen. Then a whole rank, peeling off the back of the crescent and reforming into a loose line going east into the thinning storm. And then another. And then another. And Thea watched the 345 become 300, and then 200, and then, in the slow, soundless way that a thing of that size comes apart, less. The men who stayed were perhaps 80. They did not draw their weapons. They did not move forward. They sat their horses in a ragged half-circle around her gate and looked at the woman called Crystal, and at Hamilton under his horse, and at the wolf, and they waited to be told what they were now. Hamilton, from under his horse, laughed. It was a short, breathless sound, and it ended in a cough that had blood in it. Crystal, you always did have the better speech. I had the truth. It is easier. You will not take me alive. I will not need to. The horse is on your ribs. Hamilton smiled, with red in his teeth. The Lord will send another column. He will send 3. He will send 1, and it will arrive to find a more that has heard the story. Hamilton looked at Thea then, and his colorless eyes were quite clear. "Good wife." Thea said nothing. "I did not give the order on your husband. I carried it. The order came from the Lord's own mouth. I do not say this to ask your pardon. I say it because you are owed the name. The name is Austrin. He is at his hunting lodge at Greymere this week. He will be there for another 9 days. He is alone but for 20 house guards. The road from here to Greymere is the old drover's track. You will not find it on any map of the realm." Thea looked at him. She did not feel anything she could have named. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I am dying, good wife. And because I have wanted for 2 winters to know whether the witch widow on the broken edge of the moor would do the thing I am about to give her the chance to do." She did not answer that either. Hamilton closed his eyes. He was still breathing when Crystal stood up and walked away from him, but he did not open his eyes again while Thea was watching. Elroy said, very quietly at her shoulder, "Good wife, I am not going to Greymere. No, I am not a sword. I have never held a sword. I am a hedge healer, and I have a child and a wound the size of a man's belt to clean on a creature who cannot tell me where it hurts. I will not be going to anyone's hunting lodge." "No. Then we will." "You are 10. We are 10 with the truth and a more that will now carry it." He looked down at the wolf, who had lain down again in the mud beside Pell with his great head across the child's lap and his eyes closed. "We will leave him with you, if you will have him. You are leaving your king with the hedge healer. We are leaving our king with the woman whose fence he chose." He looked up at her and his dark eyes were very steady. He will not live in a hole again. He will not sit a throne again. He will live the rest of his life on this moor, on the bench by your hearth or in the lee of your barn, as a wolf, and he will be safe. Because you have already proved on this porch this morning that you will not give him up to 350 men. We have ridden with him for 6 years to find a hearth that would do that. We have found it. We owe you, all of us, more than we can pay, and we will spend the rest of our lives paying it in the small ways available to us, which will mostly look like nothing at all." "Why me?" "Because the night you walked back into your house for the bucket, my men and I were on the ridge with bows. We were going to shoot you if you came back out with a torch. We did not shoot, because you came back out with a bucket." The wolf at her feet did not open his eyes. Pell stroked the matted fur at the side of his head with the slow, steady rhythm of a child who has been waiting all her life for an animal of her own. Crystal walked back to her horse and mounted up. The 80 riders who had stayed sat their horses and waited. Elroy turned to Thea and said, "May we use your well?" "Yes. We will water the horses. We will take Hamilton's body if his men do not want it. We will ride for Greymere tonight by the drover's track. And we will leave you 4 of our number for 1 moon, in your barn, not in your house, to keep the rest of Austrin's writ off your gate while word of what happened here spreads. After 1 moon, you will be a story that even Lord Austrin's brothers will not want to be the next chapter of. After that, no one will come for him. And after Austrin, there will not be an after Austrin we need to plan for tonight." Thea looked at him for a long moment. "You said you were the wolf's sworn guardian since he was 4 months old." "Yes." "And you can leave him. He chose his hearth. My oath was to keep him alive until he chose one. He has. The oath is done." He looked down at the wolf and the child, and his face did the small movement of a man not letting his face do something larger. And he said very quietly, "Goodbye, my king." The wolf did not open his eyes. He breathed in once, deeply, and breathed out. And the breath ruffled the hem of Pel's nightdress where it lay in the mud. The Heil riders watered their horses at her well. They did it in shifts, 4 at a time, and the 80 Iron Reach riders who had stayed sat in their loose half-circle and watched. And after a time, one of them dismounted and came forward through the gate without a weapon and helped lift Hamilton's body off the dead horse. And 3 others came forward and helped him, and they took the body away on a litter of 2 spears and a cloak between them, the way men did on the moor when a death had to be carried home. The dead horse they could not lift. Thea, with the healer's part of her brain working the only way it knew how, said to Elroy, "There is a knacker at Bridewell who will come for the carcass for the meat and the hide if you send a boy." Elroy nodded and sent a boy. The 80 Iron Reach riders, when the body of their steward was on its way, did not move for a long time. Then their senior rank, a heavy-shouldered man with a gray beard, walked his horse up to her gate alone, and he dismounted, and he came up the path on foot, and he stopped 6 paces from her porch and went down on one knee in the wet mud. "Good wife." He did not look up. "We did not know about your husband. Some of us suspected. None of us knew. I am Cold Garrick. I rode in the column the night your man went out. I did not ride into your village. I was held at the road. But I was in the column. I will carry that." Thea looked down at him. "Stand up, Garrick." He stood up. He was older up close than she had thought, with the long, weathered face of a man who had been a soldier since he was a boy. "Go home." He nodded and went. The 80 rode out the way the 300 had ridden in a loose column at a working trot, and the moor swallowed them up by mid-morning, and Thea was left standing in her own yard with 10 Heil riders, a child, a wolf, a dead horse, and a porch that had a great smear of mud across it from where the wolf had sat. She did the next thing. She could not afterwards remember choosing to do it, but it was, in the order of things, the next thing. She went into her house and she put water on the fire. She brought out clean linen and her healer's bag. She brought out the small clay pot of honey that she kept for burns and the larger clay pot of yarrow and comfrey salve that she made every autumn from the last of the late herbs. She brought out the iron shears that had been Halden's. She came back out onto the porch. Elroy and the woman called Crystal and 2 of the other riders were waiting by the wolf. Pel had not moved. She was still sitting in the mud with the wolf's head on her thigh, and she had begun, while Thea was inside, to comb the matted fur at the side of his face very gently with her small fingers. The wolf was asleep. "We will need to lift him onto the porch. The wood is cleaner than the ground." Yes, and the 4 men lifted him. He was lighter than he should have been for his size. The kind of lightness that made Thea's mouth tighten because she knew exactly what kind of starvation it took to make a creature that big, that light. They laid him on his side on her porch on the wide blanket she brought out, and Pel came up the porch steps after him and sat at his head without being told, and put her small hand on the crown of his skull and left it there. Thea knelt by the throat wound. "Talk to him." The child did not talk. The child could not talk. But Pel understood what was being asked of her, which was to make a noise that the wolf would recognize as friendly. And she began to hum. It was the 4-note hum that Thea hummed to her at night when the wind was bad, the only piece of music in the cottage, and the wolf, asleep, let out a small breath through his nose at the sound of it. Thea cut away the matted fur. She washed the wound. She washed it again. She washed it a third time, with the water as hot as the wolf could bear, and the wolf did not flinch, although a tremor went through him twice. She debrided the worst of the rotten flesh with the small sharp knife she used for boils. She packed the wound with honey first, because honey would draw out what the washing had not, and then she covered it with the salve, and then she wound clean linen around the throat in long, slow turns. Not tight, not loose, with Elroy holding the wolf's head up off the boards for her so that she could pass the linen underneath. She tied the linen off. She sat back on her heels. He will keep the scar. He has earned it. He will need to eat small and often for a moon. He will need to be warm. He will need to be inside when the nights are hard. Yes. Thea looked at her own front door. She looked at the wolf on her porch. She looked at Pell, who had not stopped humming and whose hand had not left the wolf's skull. We will need to widen the doorway. Elroy made a small sound that was almost a laugh. We will widen the doorway. Two of his men, by mid-afternoon, had taken down her door frame and rebuilt it half a hand wider, with planks from her woodshed and nails from Elroy's saddlebag. By evening, the wolf was inside her house. He lay on the rug in front of her hearth with his bandaged throat on Pell's lap, and Pell sat with her back against the bench where she had slept every night for 2 winters, and the wolf slept the deep, clean sleep of an animal whose pain has been answered for the first time in 6 years. And Thea sat in her rocker with a bowl of broth and a piece of yesterday's bread and watched them. Elroy, before he and the 9 others rode out at dusk for the drover's track, came to her door. He did not come inside. He stood on the porch with his hood down. Good wife? Elroy? His name is Aldous. Is. We have called him Aldous since he was a boy. He will not answer to it anymore. I do not know if he remembers it, but I wanted you to have it. Aldous. It means old wisdom. It was a bad joke when he was a boy. It fits him better now. Thank you. The 4 we are leaving you will sleep in the barn. They will not come into the house. They will fix what needs fixing on the property. They will turn away anyone who comes up your road who does not belong on it. After 1 moon, they will go. If you ever have need of the Hale Riders, send word to the inn at Bridewell and ask for the woman who calls herself Mara. The word will reach us. He paused. We will not come back unless you call. The wolf is yours. The hearth is yours. The choice is yours. I do not want you to feel that you have been given a guard you cannot dismiss. Thea looked at him. You have ridden with him for 6 years. Yes. You may come back to see him. Once a year. At the spring thaw. If you bring no riders and no swords, and you sleep in the barn. Elroy did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was thick. I will come at the spring thaw. Thank you, good wife. My name is Thea. Thea. Then he went down off her porch and mounted his horse, and the 10 of them rode out east in the dusk toward the drover's track. And Thea stood on her porch and watched them until the moor swallowed them. And then she went inside and closed her widened door behind her. The 4 Hale Riders who stayed in her barn were a man named Bren, who had been a carpenter before he had been a rider, and who within 3 days had rebuilt her rotten fence in its entirety with timber cut from the small stand of larch behind her paddock. And the woman named Iska, who had been a herb wife in the eastern valleys before the Hale line had fallen, and who knew 3 preparations for wound rot that Thea had never heard of, and one for it that Thea had taught Halden, and a man named Cal, who had been a horse soldier, and who did very little except sit at the end of her road every morning, with a long bow across his knees, and turn back the occasional curious traveler. and a young man named Ren, who could not have been more than 19, and who, on the third morning, sat down on her porch step beside Pell and asked if he might teach her a hand sign that meant water. Pell, who had not learned a hand sign in her life because Thea had not known any to teach her, watched him make the sign 3 times, and then she made it back. And then she pointed at Aldous on the rug inside the house and made a different shape with her small fingers, a shape that was clearly meant to mean him. Ren laughed and shook his head. "No, sweet, that is not a sign. That is a thing you have just invented. We will call it the Aldous sign. He is honored." Pell, who never smiled in front of anyone but Thea, smiled at the young man Ren. Thea, watching from the doorway, felt something inside her chest that had been a knot for 2 winters, loosened by a single thread. Aldous healed slowly. The throat wound was not the only one. Iska, going over him by lamplight on the second night, found old sores on his pads from running on stone, a cracked tooth at the back of his lower jaw, and a place on his flank where a spear had gone in shallow and out again, probably more than a year ago, and never been properly cleaned. They cleaned all of it. Thea drew the cracked tooth herself with a pair of small pincers and a great deal of broth and honey afterwards, and Aldous, who had not flinched while Thea cleaned the throat wound, did not flinch while she drew the tooth either, only laid his great head down in her lap when it was over, and breathed against the inside of her wrist for a long time. The villagers came. They came in 1s and 2s at first, then in small groups because the story had begun to move the way Crystal had said it would move, and the people of Thea's village were country people, and country people did not let a story like that sit. They came up the road with eggs and small jars of honey, and once a whole cured ham, and once a basket of newly knitted mittens for Pell. And Cal at the end of the road let them through, and they came up to her gate, and they stood there, and they looked at her, and they looked at the wolf on her porch with his head bandaged, and they said, in the Moor way, "We did not know. We are sorry about Halden. We did not know." Thea, who had carried Halden's death alone for 2 winters and had not been thanked for carrying it, found that she did not know what to do with their sorrow. She thanked them for the eggs. She accepted the ham. She let the woman who had knitted the mittens put them on Pell's small hands herself, and she watched Pell hold the wool to her cheek with the unself-conscious greed of a child who had never owned a thing that had been made for her specifically. The wolf was a kind of permission, Thea began to understand. People had wanted for 2 winters to come up the road and tell her they were sorry, and they had not. Because grief made other people awkward, and because Thea on her porch with her healer's bag and her closed face had not invited the awkwardness. The wolf on her porch with his bandaged throat invited it. The wolf, by virtue of being impossible, made the smaller impossible things, saying, "I am sorry," to a widow you have not spoken to in 2 years, into things people could do. Word came 4 days after Elroy rode out that Lord Austryn had died at his hunting lodge at Graymere. The man who brought the word was a thin, out-of-breath boy on a fast horse who had been paid by someone Thea did not know to ride to her gate specifically, and the word was very short. "The Lord is dead. The lodge stands." There were 10 of them and 20 of him, and not one of the 10 took a wound past the wrist. The boy did not know any more than that. He took a cup of water from Iska and a wedge of bread from Thea and rode away again without naming who had sent him. But Thea, when the boy was gone, sat down on her porch step very suddenly and put her face in her hands and did not cry exactly, but did something that was close enough to crying that Pell came and sat against her side and pressed her small face into Thea's shoulder. Aldous, on the rug inside, lifted his head and looked at her through the open door. and the look in his stone-colored eyes was old and very tired and, for the first time, at peace. The moon turned. The 4 riders left, as Elroy had said they would, on a clear morning with a thin frost on the ground. They did not make speeches. Bren gave Pell a small carved wooden wolf no bigger than her thumb, and Wren made her promise, with a hand sign, that she would teach the Aldous sign to whoever next came up the road and asked. And Iska left Thea 3 small clay jars of a salve Thea did not know the recipe for, and made her swear to send a boy to Bridewell when the jars ran out, so that the recipe could come back to her by return. Cal said nothing at all, and shook Thea's hand once, very briefly, with the grip of a man who had handled a lot of bowstrings. And then he mounted his horse, and the 4 of them rode east into the morning and did not look back. Thea stood at her gate and watched them go, and felt the proper weight of her own house settle back onto her shoulders. And it was not as heavy as it had been before they came. It was the same house. It was the same fence rebuilt. It was the same widened door. It was the same hearth. It was, now, the hearth of a woman, a child, and a wolf. And the arithmetic of that was different from the arithmetic of a woman and a child alone, even if the difference was only 1 breath in the dark. The first hard frost came 2 weeks after the riders left, and Thea woke in the small hours of the morning to a sound she had not heard in her house since Halden had been alive, which was the sound of a second adult body shifting weight on her floor. She lay in her narrow bed in the back room and listened, and after a moment she understood. It was Aldous getting up off the rug. She heard the click of his nails on the boards, and then the soft thump of him lying down again, this time at the threshold of the back room, across the open doorway, the way a dog lies down at a door he intends to be the only thing that comes through. She did not get up. She lay in the dark and she listened to his breathing settle, and after a little while, she heard Pell, in the front room, get off the bench and pad across the floor in her bare feet and curl up against the wolf's side at the threshold. And she heard the wolf let out a long sigh, and she heard Pell's small breathing slow into the rhythm of sleep against the wolf's ribs. Thea, in her bed, closed her eyes. She did not feel the small, sharp tug behind her breastbone again. She had felt it twice, on the porch with the bucket, and on the porch with the question of what to do. And after that, it had not come back. And she understood that it had not been a bond. It had been the sound of the choice being made. The choices were made now. The thread was through the needle. There was no more pulling to be done. There was only the sewing, which was the rest of her life, and which would be done in small, ordinary stitches. In the morning, she got up and built the fire and put the kettle on. Aldous, at the threshold of the back room, rose and stretched in the careful old dog way he had now, with his throat scar pale and clean above the line of his fur, and he walked stiffly to the front door and stood there. Thea opened the door for him. The frost on the porch boards was sharp and white. He stepped out into it. He walked across the yard to the rebuilt fence and lifted his leg against the corner post, the way every dog Thea had ever known had done. And then he walked back to the porch and sat down on the top step and looked out across the moor at the rising sun. Thea brought him a bowl of warm broth with a soft-boiled egg broken into it, which was Iska's prescription for an animal still putting weight back on, and she brought it out onto the porch and set it down beside him. He looked at her. He looked at the bowl. He lowered his great head and ate, slowly, the way he had eaten everything since the first night, like a creature still confirming that the meal would still be there at the bottom of the bowl. Pell came out onto the porch in her nightdress and the new mittens. She climbed into Thea's lap on the porch step. The three of them sat there. The sun came up over the moor, the color of weak tea. Frost smoked off the larch posts of the rebuilt fence. Somewhere down the road, a lapwing called once and then went quiet. Aldous finished the broth and lay down on the porch boards with his head across Thea's foot. Pell made the hand sign for water without being asked, and Thea, who had been practicing the signs in the evenings with Pell by the fire, made the sign back. Pell made the Aldous sign. Thea made the Aldous sign. Pell, watching her own small fingers, smiled. Then Pell did a thing she had not done in 2 winters. She opened her mouth. She did not say a word. She made a small, soft sound, the kind of sound a person makes when they are testing whether a sound will still come out of them. And the sound was not a word, but it was a sound. And it was the first sound Thea had heard out of Pell that had not been a hum or a breath. Thea did not move. She did not look down at the child in her lap. She looked out across the moor where the sun was clearing the ridge, and she felt Pell against her chest take a slow breath in and let it out. And she said, very quietly, into the cold air, "Take your time, love. There is no hurry." Aldous, on her foot, sighed in his sleep. Thea stayed on the porch with the child in her lap and the wolf across her foot until the kettle began to whistle inside the house. And then she stood up, carefully, and gathered Pell up onto her hip the way she had done since the first night the child had come to her. And she went inside to make the porridge. Aldous got up and followed her in. The door was wide enough for him now. There were a few moments in that first year that she would remember more clearly than the rest. The morning, 3 weeks later, when the village midwife came up the road for the first time in 2 winters to ask Thea to come with her to a birth at the upper farm, because the girl was small in the hips and the baby was sideways. And Thea went, with her healer's bag, and Aldous walked at her heel all the way to the upper farm and lay down in the yard outside the door while she worked. And the baby was born alive. And the new father walked Thea home in the dusk and would not stop thanking her. And Aldous walked at her heel all the way back. The afternoon in the spring, when Elroy came at the thaw, alone on a different horse, and slept in the barn for 2 nights and ate at her table for 3 meals, and did not say much of anything except to Pell, to whom he taught 4 new hand signs, and who, by the end of his 2nd day, had said 2 whole words out loud, neither of them important, both of them his name mispronounced. The evening in early summer, when a peddler from beyond the river came up the road with a pack of trade goods and stopped at her gate and asked if she was the witch widow with the wolf, and she said yes, and he laughed and said his cousin in the eastern valleys had told him the story, and his cousin had said the wolf was the size of a horse and breathed fire, and she said, "He is the size of a wolf and he breathes broth. Would you like to come in for tea?" And the peddler did. And he left her in trade for a poultice for his bad me, a wooden flute that Pell would learn over the next 2 years to play. The night, in the late autumn after the first full year, when Thea woke to find Aldous standing by her bed in the dark, his head level with her shoulder where she lay, his stone-colored eyes shining faintly in the banked firelight from the front room, and he was looking at her with an attention she remembered from the first night at the fence. She sat up slowly. She put her hand on the side of his great head. "What?" He did not answer, because he was a wolf and would never answer. But he turned his head and pressed his nose, once, very briefly, into the hollow of her throat, in the place a man would have kissed if a man had been there. And then he turned and walked back out of the room and lay down across the threshold the way he did every night. And Thea sat in the dark with her hand on her own throat for a long time before she lay back down. She did not cry. She had done her crying, in small installments across the year. But she lay in the dark and she thought about Halden, who had gone out into a blizzard to answer a call that was not there. And she thought about the wolf at her threshold, who had come in out of a storm and stayed. And she thought, in a way that surprised her by being neither bitter nor disloyal, that there was more than one shape a life could have, and that she had been wrong, in the long, flat grief of those 2 winters, to think that the shape of hers had been decided. The shape was being decided now. It was being decided every morning when she opened the door for the wolf to go out, and every evening when she closed it after he came in. It was being decided every time Pell tried a new sound at the breakfast table, and Thea did not look at her, only listened and waited. It was being decided every time a villager came up the rebuilt road with a problem a hedge healer could solve, and every time Thea solved it, and every time the villager went home a little less afraid of her than they had been when they came. The shape was a wide, quiet one. It was not the shape she had imagined for herself at 20, when she had married Halden and thought she would have his children and grow old at his side. It was not the shape she had imagined at 26, when she had stood at his cairn on the moor with the wind in her hair and thought she would have no shape at all from now on. It was its own shape. It was the shape of a woman who had walked out into a storm with a bucket of feed for something she did not understand and had not asked to understand, and had been changed by the walking. She thought, in the dark, that perhaps that was all that change ever was. Walking out, with the bucket, in the rain. The morning Aldous died was an ordinary morning. It was not in that first year, or the second, or the third. It was in the autumn of the 4th year, on a clear, cool day with a high, pale sky, and there was nothing in the morning to suggest it. He was old by then, properly old. The muzzle white, the gait slow, the throat scar paler than the rest of his fur, and still cleanly closed. Pell was 10. She had been speaking, in short, careful sentences for almost 3 years. She had a small flock of bantam hens she had named after the Hyle writers, and a habit of reading aloud to Aldous from the small stack of books a traveling preacher had left at Thea's door the previous spring. Aldous had taken, in his old age, to lying in the patch of sun by the south wall of the cottage in the afternoons, and that morning he had walked out to the patch of sun a little slower than usual and had lain down in it, and Pell, going out to feed the bantams, had stopped on the porch and looked at him for a long moment, and had then come back inside and said in her small, clear voice, "Thea." Thea was at the table grinding dried yarrow into a small clay bowl. She looked up. "He is going to." Thea set down the pestle. She wiped her hands on her apron. She did not ask Pell what she meant, because Pell had grown into a child who did not say things she did not mean, and Thea, who had spent 4 years now sharing a house with a creature who did not speak at all, had learned the courtesy of believing the people in her house when they did. She went out. Aldous was lying in the patch of sun by the south wall, with his eyes half open and his great head on his paws. He lifted his head when Thea sat down beside him on the dry grass, and he put it in her lap. Thea put her hand on the crown of his skull, the way Pell had put her hand on it the first morning. Pell came and sat on the other side of him, and put her small hand, no longer so small, on his ribs. The 3 of them sat in the patch of sun by the south wall, and the bantam hens scratched in the dust nearby, and the wind came lightly across the moor and stirred the grass at the foot of the rebuilt fence, and Aldous breathed in and out, slower and slower, and at some point that Thea could not afterwards have named exactly, He stopped breathing in. He had not been in pain. That was the thing Thea would hold on to in the days after. He had been warm. He had been in the sun. He had been with his hand and his small hand both on him. And the moor he had run for 9 days to reach had been all around him. And the door he had chosen had been at his back. Pell did not cry at first. She sat very still and she stroked his ribs the way she had stroked them every day for 4 years. And after a long time she said, in the same small, clear voice, "Thea, he is gone." "Yes, he is gone." "Will Elroy come?" "Yes." "We will send word to Bridewell tonight, and Elroy will come at the next thaw. He will want to be here." "Where do we put him?" Thea looked across the yard at the patch of ground under the larch at the back corner of the paddock, where Halden's cairn was, the small, careful pile of moorstones she had carried up there one at a time over the course of the spring after his death, because there had been no body to bury. There, under the larch, beside Halden. Halden will not mind. No, love. Halden will not mind. They sat with him in the patch of sun until the sun moved off the south wall, and then they got up, and Thea sent word to the village for 2 of the village men with shovels, and the village men came up the road with the shovels and a fresh-cut length of oilcloth and did the digging themselves, and would not let Thea or Pell help. And at sundown, they laid Aldous in the ground at the foot of the larch beside Halden's cairn, and Pell laid the small carved wooden wolf that Bren had made her 4 years ago on top of him, before they covered him over. And Thea laid the iron key that Elroy had left her on the second visit, the spare key he had made before Graymere, just in case the first one was ever lost, on top of the carved wolf. And the village men filled in the grave and stood with their caps in their hands for a long, quiet minute, and then went home. Thea and Pell stood at the larch in the dusk. He chose us. He did. Why? Thea thought about it for a while. The sun was almost down. The moor was going the long blue color it went at this time of year, at this time of day. Because we were the door he came to. He was very tired. He needed a door. We were the door. That is all I know, love. Pell nodded. She put her hand in Thea's hand. They walked back across the yard to the cottage. The door was widened, still, from where Bren and the others had widened it 4 years ago. Thea had never narrowed it back. She had thought about it, once or twice, and she had not done it. And now she was glad. She opened the door, and they went inside, and the cottage was very quiet without the slow weight of the wolf's breathing in front of the hearth. And Pell, who had not cried at the south wall and had not cried at the larch, sat down on the rug in front of the fire where Aldous had slept every night for 4 years. And she put her face in her hands, and she cried. Properly. With sound. And Thea sat down on the rug beside her and put both arms around her and held her. And did not say anything at all, because there was nothing to say that the rug and the fire and the quiet were not already saying. After a while, when the crying had become the small hiccuping leftover of a long cry, Pell said into Thea's shoulder, "We will get another. Maybe. In time. Not to replace. To... She could not find the word. To keep the door open." Pell, after a moment, nodded against her shoulder. Yes. To keep the door open. They sat on the rug a while longer. The fire burned down to a steady red glow. Outside, the moor went dark, and the first stars came out over the ridge, and somewhere down the road a fox barked once and then went still. Thea, with her chin on the top of Pell's head and her hand on the warm, familiar shape of Pell's shoulder, looked across the room at the patch of rug in front of the hearth where Aldous had lain every night for 4 years. And she thought, he came in out of a storm. He stayed for 4 good years. He died in the sun. That is more than most lives get, and more than I would have dared to ask for him on the night of the bucket. Then she got up, and she put the kettle on, and she fed Pell a small bowl of broth, and she put the child to bed in the bed that had been Halden's, which Pell had moved into the year before when she had outgrown the bench by the hearth. And she sat by the bed until Pell was asleep, and then she went back out into the front room and stood in the widened doorway and looked out across her yard at the rebuilt fence and the larch and the small dark mound of new-turned earth at its foot. And she said, out loud, very quietly, to the moor and to the dark and to the wolf, "Good night, Aldous. Thank you for coming to the gate." There was something about the way she walked back out of the cottage that night, with the empty broth bowl in her hand to rinse it at the well, that I find really hard to shake. The steadiness of her. The way she did not look back at the new grave under the larch, but only at her own front door with the lantern still burning over it. If you had been Thea on that first night at the fence, with the storm coming in and a wrong-sized wolf on the other side of the rail, and no way of knowing what you were about to set in motion, would you have gone back into the house for the bucket? I would like to know what you think. See you in the next story.